Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from today. Welcome. We're really excited to be in community with all of you. We were at capacity in terms of registrants, so I imagine more people will be joining here soon. My name is Melissa Merrick. I am really proud and honored to have been asked to moderate this session, but really what that means is we're going to have really a human conversation across multiple countries. We have over 10 countries of participants registered, so welcome. Excuse me, morning here in Chicago in the US, but I know people are joining from all around the globe to really have a really human conversation about healing and resilience and thriving, really about how researchers and practitioners come together to center ourselves with community for the real prevention, healing, and resilience solutions, right? We can no longer have top-down approaches for healing and resilience, but we need to center children, families, communities in these critical prevention and healing journeys that we're all on. So welcome. I am, among esteemed colleagues and friends, and in the interest of time, we only have an hour together. I'm going to keep my comments short so that we can hear from our esteemed panelists, but also just to recognize that, this reframing from either what's wrong to what's strong. I know our friend and colleague here, Cormac, who's really helped put this whole vision of today together for us. That's something that he shares openly and honestly. I know my friend, Dr. Bruce Perry, really talks, asking new questions, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And then our community leaders, really the magic that they learn from community in these healing journeys. It's going to be a rich conversation for everyone. What it will maybe bring up for those of you attending, though, is also your own lived experiences of trauma, of healing, of thriving. And so please, know that anytime we're talking about these kinds of themes, it may impact different ones of us in a different way. Please be good to yourselves, give yourselves grace. We can't see you anyway, unfortunately, on this format. So if you need to step away and take a breath, whatever you need, the recording will be available afterwards. So if you're able to come in and out, that's great. And if you need to step away, that's also totally appropriate. Also, in the interest of time, we have so much sharing, but we want to be in community with all of you too. So we have enabled the Q&A function. I've already seen that Kathy Bullock has already put in a question for Bruce there about Alberta, where they met. Please do populate your questions. We will save, I hope, around 10 minutes at the end of the hour for us to answer some of those questions live. We may also put throughout the webinar some answers to your questions in the chat, and we can follow back with questions. So if you also have questions, ideas after this conversation that come up for you on a part 2, a part 3 of this kind of conversation, please do let us know. We're available to you. So anyway, I just want to, without further ado, recognize that everyone will give a little intro in their responses, but to kick us off, I want to go to Bruce and Cormac first and just say you all are really transformational leaders in this space, and certainly all of us who are trained in any part of the helping profession, right? We are called to use the skills and tools that we have developed to approach problems, right? But that often means that the helping professions are a little bit out of touch sometimes with real community assets and gifts and solutions. So Bruce, I want to go to you first, in particular, given the biopsychosocial impacts of adversity and trauma. It makes sense, right, that we've approached, that different disciplines in the helping professions have approached these issues with our training and our lens. But tell me about the evolution of how you approach issues of healing and trauma and resilience.
Wow, that's really easy. So let's, first of all, I'm happy to be with everybody here. This is really a unique opportunity, and I hope we replicate this a number of times to continue these conversations. But I think I should just, first of all, many of you may not know, but I'm trained as a neuroscientist and as a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And my journey has gone from being a reductionist, where we were focusing not just on an individual person and how they're functioning. We were focusing on individual proteins in small cells inside one person. And so one of the things and again, part of what I want to do as I walk you through this is help people appreciate that there is this universal interconnectedness at multiple levels of how we as biological creatures are organized, but that interconnectedness doesn't stop at the person. It goes to the family, to the community, to the culture, to the history. And so this is kind of where my thinking evolved. I started out as like a good little boy learning like all scientists do how to do these experimental things and we'd do all these experiments and we'd isolate proteins that were coded for by DNA and we saw wow, we can't understand these proteins or the DNA unless we understand these microenvironmental cues that influence how they express themselves. And a lot of you probably have heard about epigenetics and all of that stuff. That's kind of what that is, that you can sort of manipulate the chemistry around the DNA, and that'll determine how your DNA works and what it produces and what it doesn't produce. And then that turns into the building blocks of a cell. And the cells we were studying were neurons. And once we sort of I started thinking, oh gosh, we can't really understand the neuron unless we understand the system that the neuron is in, the neural networks. And then it became clear we couldn't understand what's really going on with the neural networks unless we understood the relationship between the neural networks and other parts of the brain, other neural networks. And then we couldn't understand that unless we understood that that's part of the physiology of the whole body. So the immune system and movement was involved in influencing how neurons function. And then it became clear that we couldn't really understand that well unless we recognized that the external environmental cues of a person during development and in the present moment change the biology of these systems. And the most important environmental element wasn't just the weather or the music you heard, it was the relational milieu. It was the people that were interacting with you. And then you keep going out and out and out. It's like the layers of an onion. You cannot understand what's going on in the family unless you recognize issues around housing and unemployment and then you can't understand that unless you understand the history of the development of a city that you're interested in. And all of this stuff leads me now I would that's kind of the level of thinking that was going on in our work. But in parallel with that, we were doing conventional clinical work and using the medical model lens, trying to categorize symptoms and then do the checklist. And oh, if you have this, then you need that. And the truth is, none of that worked. And when we looked carefully, what we found was that really the most important determinant of how well somebody functioned under any mental health circumstance, whether it was a trauma-related set of problems, whether it was a genetically mediated set of problems, whether it was an unknown developmental disorder, the number one predictor of how well you were doing was how well connected you were in family and community. And it was like universal. And then we started to look around. And of course, that's the same thing for physical health issues. And so a couple of things happened. Number one, I was really angry, and I still am angry. I never learned any of that in medical school. I wasn't taught any of that in medical school, even though that information was out there. That whole thing about social determinants of health that's been well known, well studied, well documented. Yet it's rarely taught to physicians. And so as I stumbled through all of this, I started to hear a few voices of people talking about the power of community. And actually, most of the voices I heard originally were First Nations voices. They were Maori voices in New Zealand. They were Aboriginal voices in Australia. They were my friends up in, in Killiam who were talking about, I would be talking about the neuroscience of the brain and development and everything. They just nod and they go, yeah, we've known that for a long time. So I'm like, yeah, I know it's kind of embarrassing that I give a whole long presentation and at the end, the conclusion is, it's really important to have grandparents involved in the life of a kid. And they're like, huh, I came and sat here for this whole time. This is what you're telling me? It was kind of embarrassing. But that's kind of how the evolution of my thinking uh, has gone. Now, I don't want to minimize the importance of understanding kind of what's under the hood. I think understanding the biology of the stress response and all that stuff can be important. But if you try to understand that in a vacuum, you will never, ever really understand it. And that's the value, I think, of the work of Cormac and some of the other folks that you will hear from, that an individual's physiology, for good or bad, is profoundly impacted by aspects of their neighborhood, aspects of their family, aspects of their relational interactions with the people around them who they love and respect. And furthermore, I'll just end with this. One of the most powerful and important things about the evolution of our work in context of this overall appreciation of the power of community and the importance of connectedness is that the application within our current systems of conventional approaches, if you just do this simple math,
Mhm.
it will be impossible for them to solve these problems. It's impossible. Even if their solutions were correct, even if the evidence-based stuff was right, we do not possibly have any mechanism or a budget to train enough people to do that kind of work. And the irony is, if we just stepped outside of the clinic and walked around the neighborhood, you would, it's not like you'd find one person who knew how to be therapeutic or provide a therapeutic interaction. You'd have dozens and dozens of people who, by virtue of their positive, respectful interaction with a person, will be providing developmental opportunities, learning opportunities, healing opportunities. And we continue to undervalue that and have the fantasy that we can program our way into recreating what is already present in a healthy community. So that's kind of why I really appreciate and respect the work of Cormac and folks that have been doing this stuff. And that's kind of the interface between what we're doing and what other people on this call are doing. So I'll
Yeah.
stop there.
I love that, Bruce. And what I think is also critical that you said there is, this necessity of breaking silos, this necessity of coming together across discipline, across community, across function in this sort of ecosystem that helps set the conditions for health, well-being, and thriving. So
Yeah,
I love that. And the relationships really do make the world go round, right? So Cormac,
it's the glue. It's the glue for all
it's
of
the
this stuff
glue.
is
It's the
relationships.
glue. It's the
Yeah.
glue. Cormac, please, we would love to hear sort of how your thinking here has evolved and sort of your reflections.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks for holding this space. It's great, and what Bruce is saying is so powerful, and it's also so affirming because when you're holding space in communities, sometimes it can feel like a very marginal uh, function, or so to have somebody like Bruce come in and actually say, you know what, I'm validating and I'm recognizing and I'm foregrounding the value of your work. It's huge. It really is. So that's why I think this conversation is also really nice to share with so many others. So thanks also to everybody who's with us. Um, when I think about community, like Bruce is saying, I think about the neighborhood or small bounded place as a primary unit of change. And there's all kinds of serendipity and surprise within that space, which I think holds individuals. It holds all kinds of life journey, including trauma, But it might be helpful just to say, I suppose, a little bit around what this looks like on Monday morning and why I think community development, primary healthcare, and indeed a trauma-informed practice can really and should really, in a lot of ways, speak to each other and be held loosely together. Best way to explain this is through a story. So I'm thinking particularly, and it's alive for me. I had thought I'll try and share a story, but I'll wait on just hear what Bruce has to say and then see what surfaced. The story that really surfaced for me as I was listening to Bruce is from Shreveport, Louisiana, and a school, Southwood High School. And the story starts on September 16th of 2021 when two groups of kids essentially went at each other and there was a melee in the school, which resulted in a number of arrests. And the following day, two groups of girls went at this. Now, for listeners who maybe are not familiar with what many, sadly, high schools look like for kids and how they experience going into a school. Often they're going in through a scanning machine. In some schools, there are security guards patrolling the halls, and that was the case in the school. But for whatever reason, at the end of those 2 days, 23 children, young people, were arrested and incarcerated. And what happened on the third day is really significant here. Local dads responded to what happened by organizing an initiative called Dads on Duty. What's interesting about this is, I mean, to call them dads on duty would be to sort of misname them because all they really did was come in and be in the corridor, high five kids, probably like I do, tell kids bad dad jokes. But what happened was really significant and it totally backs up what Bruce is saying. They loved those children back to peace in ways that the principal couldn't, the counselor couldn't, the security guards couldn't, and the police couldn't. So all of these different interventions, these institutional tools, which have their place when they're in their place, were completely misplaced. They were often actually creating counterproductive outcomes. And I think what this opens up is, I think, very, very importantly, it foregrounds, the story really foregrounds and reminds us that welfare and safety and love and joy and all of those things and how we heal is centrally about productive adults who primarily think of themselves as neighbors in communities, showing up and connecting with young people, not because they're charity case, not because they're at risk, but because they recognize their promise. They have gifts to contribute. And it's interesting, you think I'm deliberately using aesthetic language like gifts. I think it's important because I was at an event yesterday where a subset of the people there said, we're the hidden wounds group. And I thought, wow, you're also the hidden gifts group. So many of the gifts of our children are actually hidden because they're so defined by what they need. They are a problem, they cause a problem, they have a problem. Well, they also have a gift and a contribution. So defining them at risk or defining them with these labels that pathologize are really problematic. The dads on duty didn't do that. They connected with the kids as neighbors, as young adults with something to contribute. So I think what the dads in that case are saying, in a sense, is we're not here to police you, we're not here to teach you, we're not here to fix you. We're here because we love you. And so that's a very different kind of framing. That's not a group of vigilantes. That's a group of vigilant elders. And what they're doing is they're performing the irreplaceable function, which we all know we must perform, and that is to create the village. So we often say this, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, what are we doing about that? Often what we have is we have institutions that are displacing the agency of those dads. What I really liked about what happened in that story I shared with you is that there was humility on the part of the principal, on the part of the counselors. And they came and they acknowledged that the dads were doing something that no matter how good you are as a therapist or an enforcement or a first responder, you simply cannot do. So the essence of asset-based community development is saying you go into a neighborhood and you put on a pair of glasses that helps you see past labels. What you will see is that there are 6 building blocks to welfare and well-being in every neighborhood without exception. The first is the gifts of the people who live there. If we can see them as needed and not just treat them as needy. The second is the associations. There are clubs, there are groups, there are social networks, some that are already formed and some that are, willing to form if we convene them. There's local institutions like the corner mama and papa stores. We'll hear from Darrell about, the important work of faith communities shortly, but really embedded and they're local. And those institutions are, I think, really centrally important to welfare because they've decided to be community centered instead of program centered. So, you can think about that if we have local institutions that are saying our job is to take a community first, a family first, a kinship first approach, then I think what we'll end up with is a very different welfare system. And I think what we'll end up with is a situation where we're strengthening the resilience of communities, taking a community first approach and response. But those are the 3 human building blocks. We also have the place itself, and one of the questions that we got already straight off the starting block was, what about ecology? What about environment? It's hugely important. It's hugely important, and particularly, when you think the journeys of First Nations and First Peoples, Indigenous peoples, taking people and dislocating them, taking them off country, and doing harm and trauma, multiple generations of trauma by removing them from the interconnectivity and the interbeing and interecology is absolutely it's beyond, it's just not forgivable in any shape or form. And so reconciliation is required that brings us back in relationship with Mother Earth. But as well as the people, their gifts, the associations, the institutions, the place itself, we also have our stories. I've just shared a story around dads on duty. We all have stories about how community has mattered in our lives and it has helped us to heal. We'll be hearing some of those stories as we go along. We also have economy. We know that children's welfare improves exponentially when we start attending to equity and to better circular economy in local communities. And there are things we know how to do. But so often our institutions have become enforcement oriented or therapeutic top down, where they're on top, not on tap, as they should be. And so we end up almost weaponizing our welfare systems against the very assets that are foundational to recovery and to well-being. So I think, those building blocks of the individuals who live in the community, the associations that connect in the community, the institutions that serve the community, the actual ecology, the place built and natural, the stories that we have, I think are really important, and the economy. So there's 6 building blocks that if we could take care to discover, connect, and mobilize those before we intervene top down, we're going to discover an abundance perspective rather than a scarcity mindset. That's the journey I think that welfare has to go on.
Gosh, I'm loving all of these nuggets, Cormac, that you've illuminated for us. That the gifts that exist in every community are needed, but not needy, right? And that our systems to support them need to be on tap as opposed to on top. And I just think that you're helping us understand how, loving kids back to peace and how all of this magic is possible and it's happening in community, whether we call that prevention, whether we call that public health, whether we call that setting the conditions for health, well-being, and thriving, whatever it is, it's like the magic is in the community. So I would love to go to some of our wonderful practitioners here from community. Anthony, I want to come to you first because I want to hear more about the magic. Communities come in all shapes and sizes, but all with assets and gifts. Tell us about your work and any of these magical moments that you can share with us.
Thanks very much, Melissa. So I'm Anthony Morrow. I work for a housing provider based in Scotland, and we work within communities all over the country. I'll get to some of the, well, Jen, I'll get to some of the magic stuff. I thought it would be really useful at first for me to kind of clearly define why I think ABCD and trauma-informed practice are very closely aligned and are very complementary from our experience of doing this work, but also why, as the professionals in these spaces, we're not the rescuers in these scenarios. In the places where we've worked, there is historic generational trauma, there's community trauma as well as individual. But for me, the kind of light that ABCD gives to this is that you don't have to define yourself or replaced by that trauma. We know that you can heal from trauma, but that healing and actually the subsequent thriving requires other people. It requires community and it requires connection. And for me, that's what ABCD is. It all comes down to connection. And then so we were thinking about this, and we were delivering work and being part of work in communities, and started to learn more about trauma. And for me, it was about recognizing the power imbalance that still existed around trauma. So by virtue of being a professional, I was invited into spaces to learn from experts about trauma, what it is, the impact it has, what we can do about it. But actually, the people in the communities where we worked weren't part of those conversations. So one of the first things that we had to do there was really check our privilege. And we recognized that we had to go and take this conversation in a safe way out into community to help them start to begin and understand what trauma actually means for them and the impact it might have had on their lives, on the people that they love's lives, and in the place that they love's lives. And so relocating this power and having these conversations in a community, it also helped us to then start to articulate why the community themselves was so important in the healing process and like I say, the subsequent thriving process. Because we'd been told by people all of the time, and in the kind of medical professional approach, like Bruce had mentioned, people felt like they were being defined by their trauma. They were being led to believe that professionals were needed in their lives to help them be better. But what wasn't being surfaced was, as Cormac said, all of the gifts, the skills, the aspirations, the relationships that these people had. And for me, this is where it tags on. ABCD connects to that. It celebrates that, and it shares that across the community. And we've seen people really, really thrive whenever we have started to use these two approaches together. It's often said, and I saw there was a question that talked about, the kind of wall that is built around trauma. And I think that this was a real eye-opener for me. It's often said in trauma-informed practice about non-engagement. It's not wouldn't, but couldn't. And so by taking these conversations out into the community and surfacing it, we were supporting people to not only understand themselves, but to repair their relationship with themselves. Why couldn't they engage in community life and start to think about that at a very personal level? Because what we've found is that when people repair their relationship with themselves, then they can begin to build relationships with others. And that is where the kind of magic starts to happen. And I can pass to Jenna just to tell you a couple of those examples.
Great. Thank you, Anthony.
Thanks, Anthony. Hi, everyone. So yeah, thank you. I'm going to share a wee bit about the work, continuing on from what Anthony's shared already. I'm not going to share anyone's stories, but it's for them to share that. But I will talk a wee bit about my own observations with the ABCD approach and trauma-informed approach together. So I feel really lucky I get to be in a position that I get that time to build relationships. So I've been kind of doing a community building role, but also facilitating in kind of community groups as well. And at the heart of that, we have to take the time to build relationships. And luckily, I'm in an amazing team that allows me to do that. And it takes time, space, and I think that's been missing for a lot of people. Maybe people in different roles feel a bit rushed and burnt out. But that is always at the heart, and what I'm doing is that building of relationships and communities. I noticed in a particular kind of community hub that I was going to, there was a space for people to come together and connect, coffee, come in for a chat. But I noticed in these spaces sometimes there was maybe a missed opportunity for connection. real connection. Maybe some people were maybe chatting more than others, and the coffee, and maybe other people were at the edges of that, maybe dealing with anxiety, or just maybe not the right maybe approach to that. There was a lady, I'll give an example, a lady coming into this space who was dealing with a lot of anxiety, isolation for quite a long time. And I kind of suggested in this space to maybe use an approach called Spaces for Listening, which has been developed by one of my kind of friends or mentor, Bridget Russell. And it's just a very simple, give 2 minutes each to every single person who's in the space to say how they are, what's happening in their life potentially, and then a second round, 2 minutes again, maybe anything that resonated with you from what's been said in that space. Quite simple, but quite profound. There was a lot of magic that was happening at that time. So initially she maybe was just listening in the space, and that is a choice as well as an option to just listen. But over a number of weeks, she started to speak. Well, before she was just leaving the space without saying anything really. And over the weeks, as I say, she started to open up a little bit about her struggles, but also about her strengths as well. And I'm part of the space as well, so I'm speaking and saying a little bit about my own life, my own journey. And there's always a great sense of humour as well that can happen in these spaces, and I think that's a really important part of it. But her daughter was also dealing with a lot of anxiety, not attending school due to this as well. So over time, obviously I've got a short space of time to talk about this, but over time, when that trust and that safety was built in that community space, she started to obviously express a little bit more about her own skills, and started volunteering in the space. She was really passionate about making jewellery and creating things, and she shared that within a craft space. Selling the jewellery, funding for the community space. I think her confidence started, her whole body looked different, her confidence was back again. And she talked about, this has been maybe 3 years, I've noticed I've kind of been speaking to her over that amount of time. And she shared that, maybe in previous things that she had went to, she maybe felt more re-traumatized or kind of disempowered in certain spaces. And for whatever reason, this healing happened in this community space where she was, her heart opened again, her whole body, her whole life kind of changed from there, and she's connected into the community. Maybe she doesn't have that family unit, but she has that connection to community again. So there's a ripple effect. Her daughter started to return back to school, her anxiety had improved, she was connected back into some other services again as well. So there was magic that was happening within those spaces. So I think what you said, Bruce, earlier on, there's a quote that I love from Thich Nhat Hanh. He talks about we cannot be by ourselves alone, and we can only be with everything else in the cosmos. We can only be with everything else in the cosmos. And I think it's a really important thing that you've already mentioned. And there's many stories similar to that where I could talk for a long period of time about how that has changed people's, not only their relationship to self, what Anthony was talking about, but their relationship to their family, their community, and wider. So the bigger picture can be that peace, a little bit more peace again within themselves, and what that means in quite divisive times. It goes further than that as well. So
I love that sharing, Jenna, and you painted such a beautiful picture for us of the magic, and that you could see it in the body and in the opening up, right? And the community loved her back to life, right? So it's these little all the accumulation, just like we talk a lot about accumulation of risk, we can instead talk about an accumulation of strengths and of promise and maximize that possibility that's in community. I love that. I want to go to Daryl, Reverend Armstrong from Trenton, New Jersey now, and really talk or hear from you about similar, like how you see the magic happen in faith-based communities, in your congregation, in your community, but also how you keep from defaulting to religious leaders having the right answers versus really this people's healing journeys coming from the community, right? I think that's a different kind of top-down approach that I think, you know, we're talking about centering community. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts here, Daryl.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Merrick, and certainly great to be here. Bruce, thanks for the invitation, and Cormac, thanks for welcoming me into this healing and learning community. I, like Anthony and Jenna and all of us who are centered in community, believe that words matter. And our house of worship is 145 years of age. We were founded in 1880. The descendants of formerly enslaved Africans in America, who just 15 years after the Emancipation Proclamation decided for themselves that they were going to be self-deterministic and chart their own journey of faith in the city of Trenton, which, for those of you who know American history, is the turning point of the American Revolution. And so I like to think that I'm in a city where revolutions of the heart have happened and can happen. And so over these last 145 years, in the last 124 years, there's only been 3 pastors. And so my predecessor was here 53 years. His predecessor was there 42 years. And so in 95 years, I only had 2 spiritual leaders. And I cite that simply to say that there is stability in houses of worship. That's something that is inherent within houses of worship, where so much around an individual or a family might be changing. The meshed, the synagogue, the mosque, the church tends to be a staple place where people can go. And so I like to think of houses of worship as family resource centers. I like to think of houses of worship as family success centers. I like to think of houses of worship as one-stop shops where folk who are in spiritual, physical, and emotional need can knock on the door and get an answer, or at least be pointed to an answer. To your point earlier that we don't always know the answer, but we can help someone in the process of self-discovery. I want to hone in, though, on this point that you call magic, Melissa. I want to substitute a word. You know, faith is such an important part in people's journey. Point of fact, an organization here in the States, 0 to 3 study, did a parent survey and said, what's the most important aspect and influencer on your parenting? The first was that of how I was raised. And so intergenerational scaffolding happens either to the negative or to the positive. But the second biggest influence on parenting was religion and faith. And so how a person meets at the point of their religious intersection can influence how they then raise and input into that child, the next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation. And so when I first got to our congregation, I've been here 25 years now. And so I still have 25 more to go to match my predecessor. But, you know, folk would say, oh, Pastor, I love you to death. And I thought about it. I said, why would you love me to death? I said, why don't you love me to life? And so I said, let's change the words we use, right? And I've already heard it said here by my colleagues. I don't want to love you to death. I want you to live. I want you to be alive. I want you to not just survive. I want you to thrive. And so now I say, what's the new phrase? Everyone is saying, hey, Pastor, I love you to life. We love you to life. There's nothing you can do about it. And that's important because words matter. The way you speak and project verbally and 70% of communication is nonverbal. And so what you project verbally and non-verbally will shape someone and resonate with someone. And so what our friend Cormac has called the ABCDEs, asset-based community development and engagement, I simply would say, like Bruce has said in his book, A Boy That Was Raised as a Dog, attachment matters, attunement matters, and bonding matters, connections matter, right? Attachment, attunement, bonding, and connections, ABCs, and how we connect with some. You can feed someone, but you may not connect with them. You can clothe someone, but you may not connect with them. You could even provide a house for someone, but you may not attach to them. You may not attune with them. You may not connect with them. And so I like to think that faith provides an aspect of something greater inside of you to help you meet the needs of what's in front of you. And so one of the Judeo-Christian scriptures that I often point to is Romans 4:17. Speak those things that are not as if they were. Some folk would call that channeling. Or Proverbs 23:7. As a person thinks in their heart, so is that person. Right? Rene Descartes, the famed French philosopher, would have said, right? I think, therefore I am. Our thoughts, our words matter and how they shape our reality. And so I'm very careful now about the economy of words and the choice of words that we use. And so I'll end on this. In every faith tradition, there is a word for peace. And so if you're Jewish, shalom. If you're Muslim, salam. If you're African in some dialects, Swahili, it is amani. If you're English, it's peace. If you're Greek, it's eirene. But what is peace? Peace is the absence of chaos and confusion. And so what do we want to speak? We want to speak peace. And I would hope that no matter what are the differences religious beliefs have from different religious backgrounds, I would hope we all could agree that God is a God of peace and that we want peace in a community. We want peace, the absence of violence. We want peace in a home. We want peace in the mind. And where there's peace, I believe other things can flourish. And so faith traditions are to be mindful about the words that we choose and the thoughts that we project and the strength that we give from above, from inside, projected out.
Thank you, Daryl. It's really, really powerful. And I think some of your comments speak to a lot of the comments in the chat around, reframing at risk to at promise, right? Really owning what we're trying to achieve, that all children and families are living a happy and purposeful life with hope for the future. That's Prevent Child Abuse America's North Star. But again, whatever you're trying to vision and work toward, in our work to center families and center communities, words do matter. Those community norms matter. I would like to go to Nofa and Tracy and just say that as we center communities, there also seems to be a misalignment on how our systems sort of respond to what communities have, what the gifts they have, and what their needs are, what their challenges are. What ideas and solutions have you identified to help transform our system's abilities to actually nurture and strengthen community from that community-focused lens? Nofa, you first, please.
Melissa. So I'm Nofa. I'm in Regina and Treaty 4, work as part of a provincial network with Tracy. There's been so much, there's so much wealth of knowledge in the room, and so much has been said that I think really comes into our work with community. And a lot of it is really realignment into community and leaning on community, because I feel like some of these things we're talking about, and like Bruce, you were talking about, we'll talk about it in rooms and people are like, yes, we've been trying to convey this in conversations and in a way that we live. And so some of that is really reaching back, so to speak, to some of that knowledge that has been here and the people that have been here for a really, really long time. And so I think some of the things we talk about and when we bring folks together is to sit in spaces and be in spaces, those of us who work in the systems and around the systems in community, and to really experience each other. I think that the whole, and I really, Tracy does this really incredibly well in bringing us into space to create equity, a sense, I guess, of what this feels like. I think that's one of the biggest things is to create that alignment is appreciating the roles of those natural supports, the people in community. And because that's really who, as a lot of you have talked about, that's who folks go to, that the community and connections are some of those core answers of the way that healing happens, that solutions come about. And so I think some of it is to watch and be in community and know and rely on community and in terms of systems, when systems can step in, not to have all the answers. And we've made it so systematic in our world. That's why I think part of it is leaning back into community and being in community. Both those of us who are in community, because we all are in some shape or form, and some of us who work in systems have really forgotten that. So I think that the alignment of learning how to be in community, experiencing it, and then leaning in conversation with communities on where the system's roles are, when can they come in, because they find them very different. I'm going to stop there and pass it to Tracy. Let's see if.
Thanks, Nofa. That was wonderful. So as Nofa mentioned, we are in Saskatchewan, Canada, with a provincial network called Stops to Violence, and we sit in that intersection often between community and systems. And so there's a few threads I want to pull in here and then just offer an invitation. I think I'm watching the chat and a number of people come from similar places and spaces who work as people in the systems. And Bruce, thanks for your painting of the beautiful, breathing, living idea of an ecosystem. And things are not static. They're just not, and they shouldn't be. Often we talk about when things are static, life is ended, and that's not what we're looking for here. So one of the things that has really come to be forward in our work is that recognition that regardless of the system, it's made out of living, breathing beings. And a lot of that has come from story, whether it's Indigenous story from where we are, or reaching back into our own lineages, but there's a remembering in our bones of how to be together that's become fainter and fainter and fainter as time moves on. And acknowledging the impacts of colonization and especially the institutionalization of care, it's become a commodity and a product. It's become an ingredient in terms of the machines that we build to repair, but not to create relationship and wellness within communities. So just really starting to lean back into the fact that even as humans in systems, there's a remembering of how to be together that I think needs to be reactivated and recultivated, regardless of whether we're acting as community members or service providers or policymakers or whomever that is. And thanks, Daryl, for really calling that forward in terms of, from a spirit perspective, this is heart work. It's hard work and it's heart work. So allowing ourselves to be heart-led, I think, is a big ask and a big call when we've been so cultivated to be professional and almost sterile in a way. The other thing that I want to place for us too is a remembering that regardless of where we work, we are part of our communities. And so beginning of the week, I was actually gifted with a wonderful story about a northern community where we live, which is through one lens, highly labeled, highly pathologized, highly serviced, highly professionalized. However, it was an event focused around art and community. And they had researchers coming in and they had professionals coming in. And because it's a more isolated community, a lot of people parachute in. But that day, no one had their hats on as a professional. And there was people meeting each other. Nobody knew if they were the mayor or the person that uses the food pantry, or those labels were gone. And so what the potential that was created there by meeting on that human level is now there's a relationship to have conversations, human to human, rather than, you know, I'm a social policy analyst from social services, or I'm a researcher from an academic institution. And so when they meet again, that shift is going to be much, much different because, and I'm going to say it this way, because the people in professional roles had the actual opportunity to be human in those spaces. So for us, that's one of the big things that we're trying to better understand. And all the questions in the chat we hold on a daily basis. So just know, folks, that this is deep learning as well. And grateful for people that are helping those of us who are in community, who are in the front lines trying to figure this out. So I think, Melissa, that's what I'll offer in as an invitation, is just to remember the heart work in all of this.
I love that, Tracy, and I describe it as the work of love, you know, and hard work. I think all of that embraces the essence of the magic, of the healing, of the power of community. I see Bruce's hand raised, so I'm going to go to him in a moment, but I promised that we would also hear from our community. And I just thank you all for the wonderful questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of these questions. I see two themes, though, that I would like to get to. So let me just put out what we will cover. I'll then go to Bruce, and then we will, any of the panelists who want to take a crack at answering these, we will probably be at time then. So one is this fear. The fear that exists that when we listen to community and we let them really be at the helm of providing the love and the strength and the answers, right, the solutions, that they're not going to be safe. We're not going to solve their problems. Kids are going to die. Like this fear that exists anytime we talk about prevention. That's one theme that I see. The other thing is this necessity to measure impact, and how, of course, each of you, Jenna so beautifully, but all of you described, of course, we're making impact. We can see it every day in community when you see the bodies change, the levity, the laughter, the heart work. But really then how do we communicate to funders and others about that impact? So those two themes we're going to try to get at least a glimpse to. Bruce, I'd like to go to you first.
Well, really what I want to do is kind of put on my neuroscience hat to give everybody a little bit of reassurance about that magic stuff. And this is the magic of human relational interactions. You can provide a meaningful, physiologically relevant interaction with somebody in less than 3 seconds. You do not need an hour therapy session. If you are present and you are attentive and you're attuned to somebody who looks sad or looks confused or looks upset, and you give them a moment of reassurance, a connection, it can be seconds that will literally change their physiology and increase their probability of health and wellness in multiple domains, and it will build connection. And this is the power of presence. This is what's so important. This is where really understanding the biology of this is important. It's part of recognizing, listen, when we think about what makes a difference in creating health and wellness in a community, we don't have to sit around and worry about an hour here, every Wednesday at 4, we meet at this time. It's not that. It literally is running into somebody who's sitting on their front porch and taking 3 minutes to check in and see how they're doing. That's therapeutically powerful. That's developmentally important for a child. That's regulating and cognitive stimulating for an elder person. All of these areas that we're trying to sort of program around, we need to take advantage of the beauty of our own biology and listen to these tiny little rhythms of presence. And it is creating opportunity. And I think that's what everybody in this call has seen, the power of proximity, right? You put people together, half the time you don't know what the hell you're doing, good things will happen. Usually in spite of you. And that's what I want people to think about, that it's just when you put people together, that's when the magic happens. And there's a meaningful, powerful biology underneath that. And with that, I will stop.
I absolutely love that reminder that it's in these small relational interactions that you get all the good stuff, And so I guess that does feed into the fear concept, though, and wondering if any of you have specific strategies, especially in polarized political environments, that can be effective to reorient the government, the media, this dominant narrative that like we have to solve problems, as opposed to this idea of centering communities and families to get the real magic. Go ahead, Cormac.
One of the things that's really striking, Melissa, is that often the extreme becomes the mean. So people say, oh, we'd love to do community, but it's too risky. And then they'll give you the worst 3 stories they have and absolutely negate everything else. So the problem with that is what it gets us to is this idea that institutions have a monopoly over the welfare of our children. So it's pretty simple. How's that working out for us?
Not great.
Not great. There you go. So even if it were possible that by some Herculean effort that we could design institutions that meant my health was in a hospital, my child's education was in a classroom, my, political well-being is in, is in City Hall. Great. I don't think it would be, but for some people that would be nice because they're operating in a consumer culture that says we're just passive, we consume, and safety, like every other product, is delivered to us. A moment's thought would say that just doesn't work. It's interesting that in the aviation industry, they've actually evolved to think about risk and safety in much more sophisticated ways than many of the people who are in human services. And I include not-for-profits. And we could learn a lot. Very simply, and I'll do this quickly because I know we're running out of time, they talk about safety 1 and safety 2. When they actually analyzed where the biggest airline disasters were going to come from, they realized it wasn't going to come from terrorists. It was going to come from them and their inability to make connections and to work beyond silos. And we all know silos are where smart people go to do dumb things. So what they started to learn is they had to move from a safety 1 model, which says, stop bad things happening, to a safety 2 model, which is create the conditions within which good things can happen. And hey, guess what? That deals with a lot of the bad stuff too. And that's what we need to move towards. There are folks doing it already. I see a lot of questions in the chat. We will share promising practice. The last thing I'd say is let's ditch this idea of best practice, because best practice is an enemy of better practice. And if something is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. We don't have to be perfect at this. We just have to be authentic. And I think that's about getting past fear and actually moving towards love. This is not a performative act.
Oh my gosh, I think that's like a really beautiful actually sentiment to close here, because it really speaks to this demonstration of impact too, right? We sometimes wait for perfect evidence, doesn't exist. And you say, best practice or best evidence, and no, better, right? As we know better, and in these small relationships, in these small moments to really engender magic, demonstrate it, recognize it, call it what it is, all of the themes that we've talked about, we can really vision what it is we're trying to create, which is a place of love and safety and healing and an environment where everyone can show up authentically and inclusively and connectedly, right, with each other. I think this has been just a tremendously beautiful conversation. I'm so excited that we'll be able to share the recording with everyone, and you can share it with your friends and others that weren't able to make it today. We will also send resources. I'm thrilled that so many questions got answered. There's still many that are open. Again, continue to send your comments, your questions, your ideas for future conversations that you'd like to hear or be a part of. I will open it to see if any of my panelists have a final comment before we sign off and get people on their days, really holding a lot of gratitude for the conversation we've had today.
Melissa, I'll just end with, a quote from scripture that says, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of love, power, and a sound mind. Fear is absolutely an enemy. And what I believe is the friend of the good and what is godly is when we can move beyond fear and get to faith.
Thank you, Daryl. Well, thank you everyone for spending some time with us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye, everyone.